Hello, I'm Becky Hart, an independent curator, and I've been working with Suchitra Mattai on her exhibition at Unit London titled Monster. Suchitra Mattai is an Indo-Caribbean artist who was born in Georgetown, Guyana, spent part of her childhood in Nova Scotia, Canada, and then moved to the United States. She currently lives in Denver, Colorado. She earned an MFA in painting and drawing and an MA in Asian art history from the University of Pennsylvania. Since a residency at the Red Line Contemporary Arts Center in Denver from 2014 to 2016, her career has blossomed. Just after that residency, she had an exhibition titled Sugarbound, which opened at the Center for Visual Arts at Metropolitan State University in Denver. And this was really her debut in 2018. Since, she's participated in significant national and international events, the Sharjah Biennial, Biennial of the Americas in Denver, and State of the Art 2 at Crystal Bridges. Her work has also been included in important group shows, No Ocean Between Us at the San Antonio Museum of Art, Fragments of Epic Memory, now on view at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Breathing Room, a solo exhibition presently up at the Boise Art Museum. This year, Suchitra will be included in group exhibitions in Seattle, Chicago, and Sheboygan, along with Delhi, India. I want to thank Katerina Schrick, Francesca Andrews, and of course, Joe Kennedy and Johnny Burt, the founders of UNIT. Katerina and Francesca have been instrumental in the preparation of this talk. Suchitra Mattai addresses the connections and distinctions within othering behaviors by imagining beasts, hybrid creatures found in myth and fantasy that evoke fear and give insight. She invites us to explore our own monsters, especially how we are involved with othering immigrants and the mentally ill. Her Indo-Caribbean heritage and feminist position inform choices for materials and symbols that resonate deeply, inviting empathetic identification with her subject, the monstrous. So Suchitra, before we really launch into the exhibition, I thought it would be important for our audience to kind of find out who you were. And I know that we had our first important conversation during Sugarbound. So could we look at skin first? And can you talk a little bit about how your work develops conceptually?
Definitely. First of all, thank you for that generous introduction, Becky. And thank you so much to everyone at UNIT for hosting me and for organizing this talk. So skin. As Becky mentioned, a couple years ago, 2018, I had a solo exhibition entitled Sugarbound. In that exhibition, I really wanted to explore my family's history and the history of sugar in the Caribbean. I'm of Indian descent, but my family is from Guyana, and the sugar is a very huge commodity, and it was part of, it was the reason my family under British colonial rule landed, or I should say were indentured laborers, brought to Guyana to work on sugar plantations. So this piece really has resonance for me. So I can tell you first what it's made of. There are flasks of sugar of varying hues, and they're resting on encyclopedias that are entitled the Universal Standard. So that's the brand of encyclopedias. What I really wanted to get at with this work is a sense of the relationship of power in the Caribbean, and in essence, the idea that history could be captured in certain volumes of an encyclopedia from a Western perspective. Was really something I wanted to tackle and unravel. And so in this work, the idea of skin and the relationship of skin color around the world, really, but in the Caribbean as well, really has a strong relationship to power. And that's really what this work is about.
Yes, thank you. I thought it was good to start here because your work does have a very strong conceptual basis. But if we could go to look at maybe the next work, The Past is Present. You made this just right after Sugarbound, I think. And I found this to be kind of a revelatory piece and in some ways very seminal to your practice. Can you talk a little bit about found imagery and materials and technique?
Yes. So this work includes a number of found prints, found needle points that I then rework and reimagine. And in my practice, found objects hold a really important place, as do craft practices. So embroidery, crochet. I learned a lot of those practices from my grandmothers. And so they've always been really important to me since I was a child. And so I've now
Maybe we can look at this a little bit closer in the details of the yeah, there we go.
There you go. There you go. So the central work is called Castaway. And it's really interesting that I was able to find. I thought it was, when I found it, I was so excited that there was this needlepoint that existed in the world in mass production that actually depicted a scene that seemed very, very much about colonial presence in, the Caribbean. It could be South Pacific, but here, what I've done is I use thread and embroidery to highlight the central figure. And in all of the work, what I'm trying to get at is really a conversation between these smaller works about colonialism, about history, about giving voice to people of the past whose histories might have only been told and shared in an oral fashion. And so my work, is a visual parallel to those stories.
Yes, and you're combining a lot of imagery of women, of people people in Guyana, but you also have these sort of geometric forms. Do you want to talk just briefly about lines and rays and geometry in your work?
Yes, so I was originally trained as a painter, and in my early career, I painted a lot of landscapes that were, heavy in pattern and ornament, and the juxtapositions would cause a very disorienting space. And so when I'm looking at this, and the disorienting space really had to do with me living between different cultures and the disorienting experience of migrating, in a number of times. And so these works, when they're partially figurative, and then a number of them are also landscapes. And so what I wanted to do was create an intervention in these scapes that are very European pastoral, and then to have this kind of intervention that felt very strange and unusual within the scapes.
Yeah. I think also what's interesting is how you begin to rewrite histories by making these interventions. And let's go back. So rewriting histories, we're going to see as a theme here, but let's go to the next piece, Demerara Dreams, because I think that this is another one of those very important works in your practice.
So as artists, we often look to our own stories to speak of universals, and this work actually, the origination is a photo from the 70s of me as a child, and I only spent a few years in Guyana as a child, but I have memories. And one of my earliest memories is just of playing in the garden with my family, with my cousins, and the kind of very lush backdrop of that. I wanted to tell the story, though. I chose this particular photo because there's something very serious and almost perhaps a little alarming about the expression on the child's face. And sometimes the stories aren't all joyous. But in this particular story, yes, it's my earliest memory, but it's also a memory of my relationship with my mom and my earliest memories of that. And so I have included her sari, an actual sari that I asked for. So I often include a lot of personal elements in my work, personal materials and histories. And I think the intimacy for me is really important. So yes, there are a number of objects that are found, but some of them are personal. And actually, this painting is on view right now at Fragments of Epic Memory, a survey of Caribbean work at the AGO.
I think also what's I want to point out in this work is that you are using, applying your mother's sari as a found textile, but you're also using a commercially produced textile as the ground or the support. And you have kind of embedded yourself in the image of yourself almost as if you're hiding. I think you talked about it being hiding in the grass, but I think this is important to note here, especially as we go on to look at the other work.
Yes, for sure. I've made a number of works where I use a found, tropical pattern, and thinking about the West and the kind of perspective of the very tropical, lush scapes, and using these patterns and then embedding myself within them, or figures within them, kind of has this possibility of exploring what's revealed and what's concealed. So these hidden histories.
Yeah, great. Thank you for explaining that. It's the exotic. It positions you as an exotic other, or the figure as the exotic other. And I think that that's really important.
Indeed.
So let's look at Calypso Queen, which is kind of the next development. You want to talk about this a little bit in terms of concealing and revealing and the figure?
Yes. So, I'm really interested in giving voice to people of the past who didn't have a voice. And, many of those people are women. And so I have a kind of purpose, in a way, of empowering women. And so this series, I made a number of these where I used found, very, in a way, Baroque rugs, vintage rugs, but of a Baroque character, and used the device of a zipper, thinking about sewing and materials. And, I'm really interested in using practices that are of the craft of sewing and making, and then but using them in the service of, again, giving power to women. And so here the unzippering reveals this Calypso Queen, and I wanted to have a heroine of the Caribbean, and I've masked her face, in a way, she's both seen and unseen, and she has the agency. It's her viewpoint. She's kind of staring back at the viewer. I've also used materials that are of what one might consider, carnival, right? The kind of shiny, glittery material as well.
Yeah. It was a wonderful work. I remember the show. Both Demerara Dreams and this were in the same show. And of course, at that time, you were preparing for the Sharjah Biennial. So could we look at Imperfect Isometry? This was a huge step forward for you. And will you talk a little bit about the textiles and the entire installation?
Yes. So the idea, this was a commission, like as Becky said, for the Sharjah Biennial. And what I wanted to think about and consider is the way that political borders and boundaries impact the social and the individual. So social, being the communities and the individual. And so this installation is actually 3 parts. So the first part are the tapestries. And they are made of vintage saris. And for this particular installation, I used vintage saris from my own family, from India, and from Sharjah. And so what I was doing really is taking these, this clothing that is of the body of the South Asian, of women of the South Asian diaspora, and then physically weaving them together as a kind of metaphor for connecting the communities and empowering women. In addition, the video on the screen, I actually went to borders that I considered contentious, and or many of us consider contentious, and took video of the actual border walls. So, of course, the US-Mexico border, the Palestine-Jerusalem border, and then also prison walls as a metaphor. And so the video is actually very disorienting, and the space becomes disorienting as well. And one other element is the merry-go-round, which was taken from a deserted playground in Sharjah or in the area, and then set on a motor to spin. And so the whole work becomes, again, disorienting in the way that when one is, when one migrates or is displaced, what that might feel like.
Yeah. I thought one of the things that I learned from you working with this piece when we reconfigured it for the Biennial of the Americas was the fact that that the Indian diaspora is global, and that there are women who actually are in service in the UAE. And how did that influence your choice of what to make?
Yes, so there is a large South Asian population in the UAE, and in a way, the saris become the entire structure of the saris become a monument to those women.
Yeah, and I thought the other thing that was so important is that you join these geographic locations in this single unit, and how it gives rest and respite from the sun during the day, and this beautiful framing of the video at night.
The other thing that happens that because it's rear projected, you're able to walk around it, and then the figures become silhouettes behind the installation. And so I found that to be really special.
Yeah, I didn't understand that. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, shall we move on to Mother Tongue? We've talked about this at length. I felt that this was one of the pieces that was very much a breakthrough because of the way you created sort of a shrine, and the shrine was to your past and to your heritage, and yet it's incredibly personal.
Yes. So I am and have always been interested in reconnecting to my past. And that past begins in India, and specifically in Uttar Pradesh. So I wanted to make a work that spoke about the relationship of diaspora to the homeland. And so Mother Tongue, is basically alluding to the fact that, in Guyana, our mother tongue is English, being a British colony. And so our ability to communicate with people in the homeland becomes very challenging, because Hindi is no longer, we don't know Hindi. And so the whole idea of having this mother tongue, but not being able to speak in it, and not being able to communicate with, those people of the homeland was really important to me. So the personal aspect to this work, it also becomes a monument in a way. The backdrop is a hand-sewn a set of table runners from my wedding. And so, my mother recently moved from our childhood home and sent me all these wonderful materials that I became inspired by. And so actually my aunt, who is now deceased, made those table runners. And so there's this life that I'm giving to these materials. And then in the niche it's actually a Kathakali dancer. And so Kathakali is a theatrical dance. And this figure is Arjuna, who's from the Bhagavad Gita. And so and then the braids, of course, I often braid these vintage saris, and then it becomes a reference to the braids that Indian women have. And then my mother's dupatta, which is the scarf that you wear with some Indian outfits, is also embedded in there.
I think that one of the things about this is that this is the shrine that you've created is so much like a domestic shrine, and reused elements that you would find in a domestic setting, but not necessarily in a shrine. And I think that it reads very well and very richly for that reason. This is also an important work because you've begun here, and you did a little bit, this is right when you begin to allow the textiles to pour onto the floor, and they become very fluid. And so I think that that's important in the work that comes to Monster. So let's look at Monster. This is the titular painting for the show that's now on view at Unit London. And I knew it, I saw this and I smiled because it's so much about you. The textile that supports it, the silhouetted figure, and the broom. So could you kind of take this apart and let us know a little bit more about it?
Definitely. So the impetus for the exhibition really was about thinking about the parallels of how we, other communities that we don't understand. And specifically for this exhibition, I was thinking about communities of immigrants and communities of the mentally ill. And this work, we mentioned that I use found objects, and the objects often have a history or an aura that I'm trying to collaborate with. And so for this work, the material that serves as the support for the work, the backdrop, it's actually, I think you said it, Becky, it was I'm forgetting the exact.
It's based on a toile de joie, which is a copper plate print of the 18th and 19th century.
Yes, so I have used toile before, and this is not an exact toile, so I just wanted to make sure I had that right in the process. But the imagery in it has a combination of European pastoral scenes, and then also a kind of exotification of the East. And so that becomes the backdrop for this figure. I use a lot of found prints, found colonial prints. So from, it might be explorers and voyagers and colonialists who are in other, lands, who make these prints to capture, the people and the landscape that they're conquering. And so the figure comes from one of these prints. And I took the figure and created this monster.
Look at that. Yeah. Maybe we could look at the next slide to see that. Yeah.
So this is one of the figures that relates to that other figure. And the pattern that I actually used for the previous slide is from memory, and it's of Indian textiles. So I'm really, of course, excited about textiles and have always been. And so the pattern that I used, even though I, created it from memory, it is based on patterns that I've seen in my home.
Yeah, maybe we can look at the painting again. Yeah.
So the broom becomes something, it was interesting for me because it reads, well, I should start. This kind of broom is what we use in the Caribbean. And I remember my grandmother bringing one in a suitcase or bringing the parts to create one because she said that ours didn't work quite as well. And so I created this broom. It's not a real broom. And I wanted the figure to have this broom because I was thinking about socioeconomic class and the relationship of immigrants and new immigrants to Western communities, and how we view and stereotype and categorize people based on class and skin color and all of those things.
I think the combination of all this is a lot about dislocation, dislocation when in terms of being, an immigrant, but also dislocation in terms of mental health, because the Toile de Joie was a no man's land. In other words, it was something that never could have existed. And then you've taken a British explorer image and really converted it. It has sort of mean eyes, and with this all over paisley pattern, which is very much part of Northern India. And I'll just let the cat out of the bag, is that in the original, he would be holding a double-barrel shotgun. And so you have this, this reference to India, and yet the empowerment with the labor of women. And I find the whole thing very, very exciting. Maybe we could just click to 2 slides and just see the detail of the side of the mythic beast. And I just want to point out, I think that this shows you that this would have been an explorer in the original, and point out that, we know Mount Everest, and yet George Everest never went to Mount Everest because he wasn't allowed in. He sent Indian geographers in to do the surveys, and then mathematicians to triangulate and map, what would that be? Eastern India, Tibet, and Nepal. And of course, he's the person who takes the claim. And so in your work, has the fame for that. And so in your work, you reclaim this. And you create this real sense of mystery about who is this? Who is the person in that costume, and what is it that is in his hand? And I find that that's very, very compelling.
Thank you.
The next slide. Yeah, a world without secrets knows no pain. Now, when we were sitting in a cafe in Chelsea in October talking about this show, and you said you wanted to make it about mental illness and othering, I was terrified. I thought, how can Suchitra do this? And of course, by using the conceit of the monster, and I see that we don't have the full view of this, but this piece with the fur that goes down and pools on the floor is almost as if this figure is being concealed and revealed by a serpent. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the world without secrets and what you're getting at here.
Yes, so I belong to both communities that I spoke about, right? The community of immigrants and the community of the mentally ill. And I really wanted to create a show, an exhibition that addressed, like I mentioned, the parallels. But within that realm, there's so much to talk about. And, I think there's so much shared experience from family to family, not just through the immigrant experience, but specifically thinking about mental illness. And in this particular work, you mentioned the serpent, which shows up in many different works of mine, even ones in this exhibition. And, I'm looking a lot to the space of folklore and myth. I see those spaces as spaces that allow for a kind of subconscious reworking of ideas and playing with ideas in an experimental way. And so that language is something I've adopted for the work for this exhibition. And so in this particular work, yes, she is being consumed. There is a monster. There's this monster inside. And, I think in some ways, if we can all face our own monsters, we could let go of some of the biases we have against the communities I'm talking about, and perhaps have more, empathy, sympathy for those communities, and connection, really.
Yeah. Can we look at the next one? And I just want to say that, what it made me reflect on was sort of the social and psychological harm that has been caused by lockdowns and isolation, and that, you know, the way Black Lives Matter was reignited in the United States was really important, but we're also realizing that there's all sorts of psychiatric and psychological issues that weren't really being paid attention to until people started looking at death rates and other metrics. And so this is such a brave show to be bringing it up now, because it is part of the world we live in. And I think that if we're really honest, and I love the title of this, A World with No Secret Knows No Pain, because it really, there's such a release in this particular piece.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that this particular time has brought attention to the kind of shared experiences that we have had. And I think that that's, you know, in a way, I've always wanted to do a show like this. And I think that it felt like the right time and the right space, a very open space to do it.
Yeah. Of course, you did a lot of reading about monster theory and thinking about Nietzsche and the Stoic, and this idea that to do a show like this, you have to almost know it from the inside. In other words, you have to be a participant in the communities that you're commenting on. And I think that as, you know, the audience and the public see this exhibition, one of the things that I found so compelling was how sometimes you let things just fall apart. You showed us the world falling apart or not making sense in these paintings and these sculptures. And I think that that is a real tribute to you, but also a real strength of this work.
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Shall we look at, yes, Ashok Yakshi.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about how to transform some of the objects that I find in terms of sculpture. So a lot of my work is two-dimensional or fiber-based, but I'm very interested also in sculpture, as you can see from the exhibition. And you know, it's very much a part of my practice. So the Yakshi is a celestial dancer, and the object is really off of like architecture in India. And so the initial work, the initial object, was something I have held you know, dear to me for 20 years. And it came back into my hands from my mother's home. And I wanted to create a work that talked about authenticity, because that's something that a lot of diasporic communities think about. The relationship, again, to a homeland and what we've lost and what we've gained. And so in this work, I've used 3D, the process of 3D printing to create a modern version of the Yakshi, and to think about authenticity in that way. So the object is no longer, it's in its form, it has the same morphology, but it no longer has the aura of the original antique. And so within that, this grid, they're actually gold leafed. And so, you know, gold leaf, of course, harkening back to India and some of the art forms there. But then there's this sort of odd person out, and you know, painted in a very different way, in a more contemporary way. And yeah, so the work to me kind of speaks about this authenticity, this relationship to history, and the aura that antiques have.
From what you've just said, you grew up around this object, the original?
Yeah, so I actually purchased it in India and then gave it to my family. And then the other thing, you know, from a Western perspective, icons, figures of you know, Hinduism or Buddhism are sometimes, you know, they're exotified, but they're also almost considered monsters in a way, right? Because they're from monster theory, there's so much there, but one of the things that I drew from it is just this idea of how in many cultures monsters are half beast, half human, or have powers that are inconceivable, or they really exist in this sphere that is intangible. And so the figure within, which is a little hard to see, the figure is actually quite in the middle. She becomes a monster.
She's a female figure reaching up to grasp the trunk of an elephant, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, these gods, the deities also can transform themselves from one manifestation to another. And that's part of the fearsomeness of the beast, of the monster too. Yeah. Also, I think what's interesting in the work is that you lived with the memory of this piece for many, many years, and then the moment came to use it. And I find that that's very interesting about the work. Somebody asked yesterday when we were doing a walkthrough, when you work, do you sit with the work for a very long time and then come back and resolve it? And so can you talk a little bit about, once you knew you were going to use the Akshi, what was the process, and do you sit with things and revise them?
Yeah, I think I'm a very intuitive maker. Though my work can be considered conceptual, I make with a kind of wild abandon. And so sometimes I'll find objects that I immediately have to respond to and make something with. And then other times I have objects, lying around my studio or within memory that I, suddenly have the moment arrives where it fits with something that I want to make, or it inspires me in some way.
Yeah, and I think that in the scheme of things, you make work rather quickly, a week or a month to make a piece. And then if you want to come back and visit it, you look at the materials and the images, and you find that the images are used repeatedly. Just like I know that the monster figure that based on the British print, or a French print maybe, that showed up in this show will show up in other works. Actually, it's right behind you, isn't it? In the painting behind you, and you revisit the imagery.
This one you're totally right, and I think this one is the one behind me is a little different, but they become almost iconic for me, and so the forms capture something that I'm looking for: the silhouettes, the shapes, the reference, the historical reference, and then I don't feel always satisfied with the one use. Like they have a place in other work, and so I definitely explore that. I also sometimes reclaim my own work. So I might look at something that was earlier and then realize that, oh my goodness, I should have done this. I need to do this, and then I will rework it as well.
Yeah. Okay, shall we look at the last piece we have in the presentation now? A Cape of Glass, a Heart of Gold. And before you talk about it, I think that one of the things that is really interesting is you almost always offer us two options in the title. Just as like within yourself, you are accepting the very creative person who has the discipline to make this work, and a person that lives with a mental illness and grapples with that. And I think that it's really interesting that you almost always offer us options in this work, and quite often in the title itself. So this actually started with something that most of us might have considered to be catastrophic, and it became quite an amazing piece of work.
Yeah, so I came into my studio. It was actually the first day that I had my conversation with Joe at UNIT, and the glass in my studio was shattered. And threw me off a little, and I was a little, dismayed, and I was scared at the possibilities. But, I collected the glass and decided that I could use it in a way that offered solace and hope. So I used this found figure, this found sculpture, and created a cape for her that offered her safety and support. And then, in a way, I think this work captures the exhibition. She's a heroine, though she's both heroine and misfit, I guess. And there's a portal that I've created. There's vintage saris that are woven into metal to wire mesh, and then that acts as the outer ream of this portal. And then I've included also these tropical palms. And so this is a space for reconciliation. And I really think a lot about the materials I use and the kind of problem solving I'm interested in. And it really is, in a way, about reconciling a very disparate and diverse past. I don't really think of any one place as home. And so this space here becomes, in a way, more about passage and reconciliation.
Yeah. You use the word portal, and of course, I see this with the palm branches and the rays, as the tropical sun. But the portal has been important to you, particularly when you talk about the Middle Passage. And you want to talk a little bit about the Middle Passage, and why is this important to you?
Yeah, so the transatlantic passage, or the Middle Passage, was basically traveling the ocean as slaves and indentured laborers, people traveling the ocean in that way. And so the slave trade and the indentured labor trade. And so knowing that my grandparents on one side and great grandparents on the other side traveled in these small ships, of course, around the Indian Ocean and then across the Atlantic, really, just struck me. And of course, everyone who has a relationship to that past, it has sort of we have a deep connection with the Atlantic in that way. And so I was actually a professor on a ship that through a program, and I was able to cross the Atlantic and cross the Middle Passage. And I felt this sort of immense connection. I've lived, other than now where I'm in Denver, I've lived mostly along the Atlantic, and I have this sort of deep connection. And I have made work in the past that, shares this portal, and, just thinking about the shared space of these laborers, my family as indentured laborers, looking out to this vast ocean and not knowing about their future, and having kind of this longing for a past.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the other thing that would you talk about the dark waters?
Yeah, so I think, in a historic way, crossing the Kalapani, or the Black Waters, which is really like leaving India, one kind of loses the relationship to a caste system and to sort of a ritual purity. And so I feel as though, in some ways, this sense of belonging to, India as the homeland is really something that is questioned. And I think that, it's not just about the displacement is not just in the West, but it's also when you think about the relationship to a homeland.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting throughout the work that we've seen, is this idea of the hybrid that makes the monster, the way you can put things together and they are very beautiful, but at the same time, there's this dissonance in them. And so that both beauty and dissonance live together in the work. And I think that it highlights sort of the porous nature of the boundaries between us and them. And that's where the strength of the show is, because how can we honestly say, look at ourselves? We see parts of ourselves in this work, and so we see parts of ourselves in the beast. And I think that what you're getting at here is challenging people to have the empathy to identify the bestial in each of us, and to discover similarities and common ground. And by joining your experience as an immigrant and your experience as a person who lives with mental illness, I think, as I've said before, is very brave. But it also asks the question, it turns the mirror, and we need to look in it and say, is it self and other, or is it self? And find the self in the other. So I'm going to end there. I know that we have some questions and answers, some questions now, and I think that let's show people at home the exhibition. Do you want to say the titles? You want me to butcher them? This is Through the Woods, Across the Sea, and Home.
Yes.
It's a beautiful tapestry, and you'll see in it the white flecks as if it were weather, as if something were blowing from here to there, the ocean. And I did want to talk about, I'm so glad you talked about Kalipana Pani already, because I think it's such an important concept within the work. And the water imagery shows up so often. I think that you see it particularly in the work at the Sugar Hill Children's Museum right now, and in this work. But you see, now we can see a full view of A World Without Secrets Knows No Pain.
Yes.
Yeah, the next. Do you want to talk at all about boundaries?
Yeah, so the hanging suspended work is Guardian. Yeah. And this work basically is comprised of gates and vintage sari and fabric. And basically I wanted to have a work in the show, like the portal, which offered a space of safety. And, in a way, the gates ward people off, but they can be opened, and they also offer, in a way, it probes the question of why we have these gates.
Right.
This one is Bodies and Souls, and it's made from Indian outfits from my family and community. And I wanted to kind of think about displacement and the kind of challenges that immigrants face, but also how they're collectively viewed, not as individuals. And so they become kind of this mass or body. And a sculpture that is called Ring of Fire that really asks us to sit down and talk to one another. And then another work called Durga that again thinks about the icon in the way that the 3D printed sculpture, Yakshi sculptures, do as well.
So I'd like to invite Francesca to join us now. And I see that we have questions. I think you're going to end up answering most of them, Suchitra, but I'll chime in.
Of course.
Firstly, thank you both so much. That was such an insightful talk. Really, really interesting to hear you talk us through the process. And thank you to the audience as well. We do have lots of questions in already. If you have any more, if you just send them to the chat box or to the Q&A on the screen, I'll read them out to Rebecca and Suchitra for you. So the first question I've got is using personal found objects in your work a way of documenting your life and that of your family? How important is it that the objects are personal to you?
That is a really good question. And in a way, there aren't a lot of written history, right? Histories of the kind of people I am trying to speak on behalf or empower. And so, and again, I can tell my own stories, and using those objects really adds an intimacy, I think, for me, for the work. And I hope for the viewer as well. And I always feel as though, in a way, including those pieces, those parts of my past really do help to tell the story, not just of my family, but of the immigrant experience in general.
And we have quite a similar question, actually, that maybe has a different angle, which is the materials you work with have so much historical narrative embedded in them. How do you manage to balance this with your personal narrative while creating something new?
That is a really great question. And I mentioned the word collaboration before, because I really see myself as collaborating with these materials and these makers of the past. And so, whether it's someone who designed the print on the sari, or someone who made the needlepoint, or the person who designed the mass-produced needlepoint. And so it's really important for me for it always to be obvious that those are found objects. And the balancing act is really about, using the kind of aura and inspiration found in those objects to tell a story that is more deeply personal. And I think it is something I think about a lot.
If I can chime in here too, I think that it's, so as Suchitra researches histories, because of just the nature of, she's looking at the history of indentured people in the Americas. There's not a lot of written history. There's oral history and lore from the family. There's photographs. Sometimes, you can find a ship manifest log or something like that, or a document for when a person was freed from their indenture. But so she has, in that unknown is a space to invent. And I think she finds that same spatiality in found objects, that she lets them be both physically present, but also kind of mysterious to her, and let the object help her. She enters into a dialogue with it that I think is really important, and you see it quite a bit in this work.
Thanks for that, Becky. That was really helpful. And I think I didn't use the terms call and response, but that's perhaps an accurate description of how I work with these objects.
And then we have another question. You talk about conversation within your work. How important is it to you that they also inspire conversation outside of the picture space?
For many years, I worked in solitude, and I made work, but I didn't really pursue sharing that work. And I think it's really important for me as an artist to share that work. And so those conversations, especially the ones that I'm interested in, are to me very important. And I hope that by sharing the work through exhibitions and whatnot, that I can generate conversations, and those conversations I feel are important. And that's why I'm much more engaged with the public in the work that I do now.
And then we have, when thinking of the materials that you use in terms of conservation, do you think about how your works will age? And have you taken any precautions to ensure the preservation of your work?
That is a great question. There are, that is a challenging question. Yes, and no. There's some unknown to using some of these materials, of course. The fiber works for sure have kind of longevity. Obviously, if they're in light and sun, there are ways to consider exhibiting them that would preserve them more, and that information is often given to collectors and museums and whatnot. I think the paintings, I use acrylic paint. I use paint that's pretty, archival. But yes, there are certain materials that are unknown, and I think Becky might, as a former museum curator, might have a better understanding of conservation.
Well, what I was going to say is Suchitra and I have had many conversations about this, about materials that have longevity and materials that don't have longevity. Her work is being actively collected by museums, and most of this work has textiles in it, which means that it's shown under lower light conditions for shorter periods of time. You're aware of this, I think, with the neon. You supply the information so that if anybody needs to replace something, you're conscious of this happening. We think of things like Dan Flavin. All of a sudden his neon light bulbs aren't available in colors, and yet the museum world and the collector world has figured out a way to reproduce this work. I think that you have become more and more conscious of the fragility of the materials you use. I think when the tapestries came back from Sharjah, both of us were shocked to see them because parts of them were literally dust. And I think that, sometimes you make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes, and it is, I've seen it inform your making and inform how you present the work and where it's shown. And that's very important.
Yeah, I think it really is a collaboration with curators, conservationists, and it's a conversation that we do have often with the galleries and museums and whatnot. And I think, as far as the Sharjah tapestries were concerned, they were in the hot sun for 3 months. And so I knew they weren't going to come back as is, but that was part of the kind of letting go, the kind of uncontrollable experience of those tapestries, or what they underwent, was very much a part of the process. And so in terms of the materials that I want to remain intact, there's definitely, conditions of light, conditions of, and I do think about replacement with the neon and whatnot. And those things are, generally shared, in all situations, shared with the collector or museum.
Thank you. And we've got a few more questions, but I think I'll just keep it to a last one so that we don't go over the hour. I think it's a question that maybe both of you will be able to give an answer to as well, which is, can you tell us about a work of yours that you're particularly attached to, or which has been a turning point for Suchitra's artistic career?
Wow, that sounds like it's kind of my question, but very much Suchitra's question as well. I think that there are seminal works, and we talked about Demerara Dreams today, Mother Tongue. Within this exhibition, seeing Monster, realizing, because Suchitra and I have worked together now for 3 or 4 years, I knew just immediately I had to find the derivation. And it's actually, if you go to the show at UNIT, the source material is in the show, so you can actually piece things together. But there's a maturity in Monster and in the works in the show, and one that's not hung, Foreigners, which is such an amazing piece about being oriented and disoriented in the world at the same time, and having things come together and fall apart at the same time. And it's a piece that I really identify with, and I find that it is one of those pieces that may be seminal. But so I have 4. Suchitra, maybe you can clarify this.
Oh, yes. It's so hard, because sometimes when I've just completed something, I feel very much mentally attached and with my heart. And, as I go, they're like children, and then you put them into the world. And so it's hard for me. I think using the vintage saris in my practice and in the initial work at Sharjah, and then in Exodus, which is at Crystal Bridges Museum, I think the use of those has really shifted and changed and transformed the way I see found objects and the kind of intimacy and the relationship of, vintage clothing to women, to monumentalizing those women. All of those things kind of have come out of using those. And so I feel like that work is monumental. I think I share Becky's choice of Demerara Dreams as well, because the story of one's past, or the story of my past and my family's past can really, I've seen, in a way, using visual language to tell stories that are often just told orally and are, like Becky said, not written down, has also been an important turning point for my work.